2 minutes ago, Iran struck Nevatim Air Base in the Negev desert with a volley of ballistic missiles that did not target the perimeter, did not target the administrative buildings on the facility's eastern edge, did not target the runway surface or the taxiway infrastructure that previous strikes in this conflict have aimed at to temporarily disrupt sortie generation. This strike targeted the hardened aircraft shelters on the western complex of the base, the shelters that house Israel's F-35I Adir fleet, the most advanced, most expensive, and most strategically consequential combat aircraft in the entire Israeli Air Force inventory. The F-35I is not merely a fighter jet, it is the platform on which Israel's entire deep strike doctrine against Iran is built. It is the aircraft that was designed to fly undetected through Iranian air defenses, deliver precision munitions against Iran's nuclear facilities, and return without being engaged. Every operational plan Israel has developed for a potential strike on Iran's nuclear infrastructure assumes the availability of the F-35I. Every deterrence calculation that the Israeli defense establishment has communicated to its allies and adversaries rests on the capability that the F-35I provides. Without the F-35I fleet, Israel does not have a credible independent strike capability against hardened targets at Iranian depth. With it, Israel possesses the single most potent conventional deep strike asset in the Middle East. Iran just hit the shelters where those aircraft sat. The satellite imagery that has begun circulating from commercial providers within the past 14 minutes shows impact signatures directly on the hardened aircraft shelter complex at Nevatim's western apron. Not adjacent to the shelters, not on the taxiways leading to the shelters, on the shelters themselves, multiple impacts, multiple shelters affected, structural deformation visible on at least 3 shelter rooflines from orbital imaging altitude, debris fields extending from shelter entrances consistent with blast overpressure exiting through the doors of structures that were breached by penetrating warheads. And the Israeli government has said nothing, not about how many missiles struck the shelter complex, not about whether the shelters held or failed, not about whether the aircraft inside were present at the time of impact or had been relocated, not about the operational status of the F-35I fleet following the strike, not about whether Israel's most important strategic deterrent capability is still intact, or whether it was just eliminated on the ground in a strike that lasted less than 4 minutes. Nothing. The shelters are damaged. The satellite imagery is visible to every intelligence agency and every commercial imagery customer on Earth. And the government that operates the aircraft those shelters were built to protect is silent about whether the aircraft survived. That silence is not routine operational security. Operational security after an airstrike on a military base involves controlling information about specific damage assessments and operational readiness timelines. It does not involve refusing to acknowledge that the strike occurred when the impact signatures are visible from commercial satellites that anyone with a credit card can access. The silence is not protecting information. It is avoiding a question whose answer, if it is the answer the satellite imagery suggests, changes the strategic balance of this conflict fundamentally and irreversibly. In the next few minutes, I will walk you through exactly what the F-35I fleet represents in Israel's strategic architecture, and why the loss or degradation of that fleet changes the calculus of this conflict in ways that no other single strike in this war has produced. I will explain what hardened aircraft shelters are designed to withstand, and what the visible damage signatures in the satellite imagery tell you about whether the weapons Iran used exceeded the design tolerances of those structures. I will lay out what Iran's specific targeting of the F-35 shelters, as distinct from the runway, the fuel infrastructure, or any other base component, reveals about the intelligence Iran possesses regarding Nevatim's layout and the strategic logic driving Iran's target selection. And I will address what the potential elimination of Israel's deep strike deterrent means for every calculation, military and diplomatic, that every actor in this conflict is making in the hours ahead. Before we get into it, thanks for watching. I appreciate every one of you being here right now. Your support is what keeps this coverage going. Make sure you are subscribed and like the video so more people can follow this as it develops. Now let us get into it. The F-35I Adir is not simply the most advanced aircraft in Israel's inventory. It is the aircraft around which Israel's entire strategic posture against Iran has been constructed for the past decade. Israel operates approximately 50 F-35I aircraft, making it the largest F-35 operator in the Middle East and one of the largest globally. The aircraft were acquired at a cost of approximately $100 million per unit, not including the mission systems, weapons integration, and support infrastructure specific to Israel's operational requirements. The total investment in the F-35I fleet, including infrastructure, training, weapons integration, spare parts, and the facilities at Nevatim built specifically to house and support the aircraft, exceeds $10 billion. But the cost is not the point. The capability is the point. The F-35I possesses a combination of characteristics that no other aircraft in Israel's inventory or in the inventory of any other regional air force can replicate. Low observable stealth technology that reduces the aircraft's radar signature to a level that allows it to penetrate advanced integrated air defense systems without being detected or engaged at ranges where conventional aircraft would be tracked and destroyed. Sensor fusion that combines data from the aircraft's own radar, electronic warfare systems, infrared sensors, and off-board data links into a single integrated picture of the battle space that the pilot can act on in real time. The ability to carry precision-guided munitions internally without external pylons that would compromise the aircraft's stealth signature, and deliver them against hardened targets at ranges that keep the aircraft outside the engagement envelope of point defense systems protecting the target. That combination of stealth, sensors, and precision strike is what makes the F-35I the only platform in Israel's arsenal capable of independently executing a deep strike against Iran's nuclear facilities. The F-15I RAM can carry heavy payloads to long range but cannot penetrate modern integrated air defenses without the suppression and electronic warfare support that only the F-35I can provide. The F-16I Sufa is a capable multi-role aircraft but lacks both the range and the survivability for unescorted operations at Iranian depth. Without the F-35I, Israel's strike options against Iran require either coalition support from the United States or acceptance of attrition rates that would be operationally and politically prohibitive. Every conversation between Jerusalem and Washington about a potential Israeli strike on Iran over the past 5 years has been built on the assumption that the F-35I would be available to execute it. Every threat communicated from Jerusalem to Tehran, explicitly or through back channels, about the consequences of crossing Israeli red lines has been underwritten by the capability that the F-35I provides. Every deterrence calculation that has shaped Iranian decision-making about how far to push its nuclear program and how aggressively to escalate in this conflict has included the F-35I as a variable. If the F-35I fleet at Nevatim has been destroyed or significantly degraded on the ground, every one of those conversations, every one of those threats, and every one of those calculations has just been invalidated. Not theoretically, practically. The capability that backed them no longer exists in the form required to execute them. The hardened aircraft shelters at Nevatim were built to protect the F-35I fleet from exactly the type of attack that occurred this morning. They are reinforced concrete structures designed to absorb blast-over pressure and fragmentation from conventional munitions striking the exterior surface. The standard NATO specification hardened aircraft shelter, which Israeli shelters are assessed to meet or exceed, is designed to withstand overpressure from bombs and missiles, detonating on or near the shelter without transmitting lethal blast effects to the interior where the aircraft is housed. The design standard assumes a specific threat: conventional air-delivered munitions, typically bombs in the 500 to 2,000-pound class, striking the shelter roof or walls. The reinforced concrete thickness, the steel reinforcement configuration, and the door design are calibrated to defeat that threat envelope. Against that threat, the shelters work. Decades of testing and operational experience confirm that properly constructed hardened aircraft shelters protect the aircraft inside from conventional blast and fragmentation effects. The question that the satellite imagery from Nevatim raises this morning is whether the weapons Iran used fall within the threat envelope the shelters were designed to defeat. The visible damage signatures on the shelter rooflines, specifically the structural deformation visible from orbital altitude, suggest that they did not. Structural deformation of reinforced concrete shelter roofs visible from satellite altitude is not consistent with a warhead that detonated on the surface of the shelter and was defeated by the concrete. Surface detonation against intact concrete produces cratering of the outer surface and possible spalling of the inner surface, but does not produce the gross structural deformation visible from space. Gross structural deformation is consistent with one of two scenarios: either the warhead penetrated through the roof before detonating inside the shelter, or the warhead delivered blast overpressure of sufficient magnitude to exceed the structural capacity of the concrete and cause the roof to deform inward or collapse. Both scenarios produce the same result for the aircraft inside. An F-35I is not an armored vehicle. It is an aerospace structure built from advanced composite materials and aluminum lithium alloys optimized for minimum weight. The stealth coatings on the aircraft's exterior surfaces are fragile and sensitive to blast effects, heat, and debris impact. The aircraft's sensor apertures, engine inlets, and canopy are vulnerable to overpressure and fragmentation at levels far below what would be required to damage the shelter structure itself. A shelter that experienced the level of structural deformation visible in the imagery transmitted the effects that caused that deformation to the interior. The aircraft inside that shelter, if it was present, was subjected to those effects. The effects include blast overpressure, structural debris from the failing roof, and potentially the thermal effects of the warhead detonation if penetration occurred. An F-35 subjected to those effects is not damaged. It is destroyed. There is no repair pathway for an F-35 airframe that has been subjected to blast overpressure sufficient to deform the hardened concrete shelter containing it. The debris fields visible at shelter entrances in the imagery reinforce this assessment. Blast overpressure inside a shelter has to go somewhere. If the roof deforms inward but does not fully collapse, the overpressure is channeled toward the weakest structural point, which is typically the shelter door. The debris fields at the entrances are consistent with overpressure exiting through blown or deformed doors, carrying with it material from inside the shelter. That material includes fragments of whatever was inside the shelter at the time of the detonation. The specific targeting of the hardened aircraft shelter complex at Nevatim, as distinct from any other component of the base, reveals a level of targeting intelligence and strategic prioritization that demands analysis independent of the damage assessment. Nevatim Air Base is a large facility. It contains runways, taxiways, fuel storage, ammunition storage, maintenance hangars, command and control facilities, barracks, and the hardened shelter complex. A strike aimed at temporarily disabling the base's ability to generate sorties would target the runways and taxiways. A strike aimed at degrading the base's operational sustainability would target the fuel and ammunition storage. A strike aimed at disrupting command and control would target the communications and operations facilities. Each of those target sets is easier to hit and easier to confirm damage against than the hardened shelter complex. Iran did not target any of those. It targeted the shelters. That targeting decision communicates three things. First, Iran knows which shelters house F-35I aircraft as distinct from other aircraft types based at Nevatim. The base also hosts F-16 squadrons. The shelters housing F-16s were not struck. The shelters housing F-35s were. That discrimination requires intelligence about the specific shelter assignments at Nevatim, information that is classified and that Iran should not, under normal assumptions, possess with sufficient precision to target individual shelters from ballistic missile range. Second, Iran chose to use its most capable penetrating weapons against the hardest targets on the base, rather than using those weapons against softer targets, where damage would be easier to achieve. That choice reflects a strategic prioritization of destroying the F-35 fleet over disrupting base operations. Runways can be repaired in hours. Fuel storage can be resupplied. Command facilities can be relocated. F-35s cannot be replaced. The production line for the F-35 is in the United States. Delivery timelines for new aircraft are measured in years. The loss of operational F-35 airframes is irreversible on any timeline relevant to this conflict. Third, the accuracy of the impacts on the shelters themselves rather than in the areas surrounding them indicates that the missiles used achieved a circular error probable sufficient to place warheads on individual structures within a complex. That level of accuracy from ballistic missiles at the range Iran fired from is not trivial. It requires either terminal guidance systems of considerable sophistication or pre-strike targeting data of extraordinary precision, likely both. Iran demonstrated tonight that it knows where Israel's most valuable aircraft are parked, that it possesses weapons capable of destroying the shelters those aircraft sit in, and that it can place those weapons on those shelters with accuracy sufficient to achieve the desired effect. That demonstration is itself a strategic event independent of the damage it produced because it invalidates the assumption that the F-35 fleet's survival could be ensured by sheltering the aircraft on the ground in hardened structures. The destruction or significant degradation of Israel's F-35I fleet at Nevatim does not merely remove a military capability from the battlefield. It restructures the strategic balance of the entire conflict. Israel's deterrence posture against Iran has rested on two pillars. The first is the nuclear deterrent, which Israel neither confirms nor denies, but which is universally understood to exist. The second is the conventional deep strike deterrent, the ability to reach Iranian strategic targets with precision conventional munitions delivered by platforms capable of surviving the flight to and from the target. The F-35I is that platform. If the F-35I fleet is gone, the second pillar is gone. Israel retains the first pillar, the nuclear deterrent, but a nuclear deterrent without a credible conventional alternative is a deterrent with no graduated response options. It is a deterrent that can only be exercised at the highest escalation level or not at all. A country whose only remaining deterrent against a strategic adversary is nuclear weapons is a country that has lost the ability to respond proportionally to provocations below the nuclear threshold. Every provocation must either be absorbed without military response or met with the threat of nuclear use. There is no middle option. That absence of a middle option is the most dangerous strategic condition that can exist between two adversarial states. It compresses the escalation ladder from many rungs to two. Do nothing or do the worst thing. Every crisis between the two states is now a potential nuclear crisis because the conventional options that previously provided off-ramps and proportional response capabilities no longer exist. Iran understands this. The targeting of the F-35 fleet was not an attempt to degrade Israel's ability to conduct today's air operations. It was an attempt to eliminate Israel's ability to threaten Iran's strategic infrastructure with conventional means, thereby forcing Israel into a strategic posture where its only remaining coercive tool against Iran is the one tool whose use would trigger consequences that Israel itself cannot survive. Iran is attempting to make Israel's deterrent unusable by making it the only option available. A deterrent that cannot be used without self-destruction is not a deterrent. It is a decoration. The Israeli government's refusal to comment on the status of the F-35I fleet following the Nevatim strike is the most consequential silence of this conflict. The silences following the Dimona strikes concealed information about damage to a facility whose operational status is important but whose loss does not alter the immediate strategic balance. The silence following the Nevatim strike is concealing information about whether Israel's primary strategic deterrent capability still exists. That information has an audience far larger than the Israeli public. Every government currently calculating its response to this conflict is attempting to assess whether Israel still possesses a credible conventional strike capability against Iran. The United States is making decisions about force posture and diplomatic engagement based on assumptions about what Israel can and cannot do independently. Iran is making decisions about further escalation based on its assessment of what retaliation Israel can deliver. Gulf states are making calculations about their own security relationships based on the perceived balance of power between Iran and Israel. All of those calculations require the answer to a single question. Are the F-35s intact? The Israeli government's silence is not providing that answer. And in the absence of an answer, the satellite imagery is providing its own. Every intelligence agency with access to the commercial imagery now circulating is drawing its own conclusions from the structural deformation of the shelter roofs and the debris fields at the shelter entrances. Those conclusions are not being filtered through Israeli information management. They are being formed independently based on observable physical evidence. The silence is not protecting the information. The information is already visible from space. The silence is delaying the moment at which the Israeli government has to publicly confront what the loss of the F-35 fleet means for its strategic posture and publicly answer the question that every ally and every adversary is already asking privately. What does Israel do now that the conventional option is gone? The strike on Nevatim this morning did not kill thousands of civilians. It did not produce a humanitarian crisis visible in the streets of a besieged city. It did not create the kind of imagery that dominates news cycles and social media feeds. What it may have done is something quieter and more consequential than any of those things. It may have removed from existence the military capability that prevented this conflict from becoming a nuclear confrontation. The F-35I fleet was not merely a collection of expensive aircraft. It was the mechanism by which Israel could respond to Iranian strategic provocations without resorting to nuclear weapons. It was the capability that gave Israeli decision-makers options other than the worst option. It was the rung on the escalation ladder between doing nothing and doing everything. If that rung is gone, the ladder has a gap in it that cannot be bridged by rhetoric, by alliance commitments, or by the promise of future aircraft deliveries that are years away from operational readiness. The gap exists now. The decisions that must be made in this conflict must be made now, and they must be made by a government that may no longer possess the capability to execute any option between acceptance and annihilation. The Israeli public does not know whether that is the situation their government is now facing. They do not know because their government is not telling them. They do not know because the silence that began with Dimona and continued through each subsequent strike has become the default mode of a government that has decided its citizens are better served by ignorance than by the truth of what this conflict has cost them. A democracy whose citizens do not know whether their country's primary strategic deterrent has been destroyed is not functioning as a democracy in any meaningful sense. The people whose lives depend on the decisions their government makes next are entitled to know the basis on which those decisions are being made. They are entitled to know whether the capability they were told would protect them still exists. And the silence that is denying them that knowledge is not protecting national security. It is protecting the political survival of leaders who do not want to face the public with the news that the shield has been shattered. Thanks for watching. I appreciate every single one of you. Drop your thoughts in the comments. If Iran possessed targeting intelligence precise enough to discriminate between F-35 shelters and F-16 shelters at Nevatim, and used penetrating warheads specifically selected to defeat hardened aircraft shelter construction against those specific shelters while leaving other base infrastructure untargeted, what does the combination of intelligence, precision, and weapon selection tell you about how long Iran has been planning this specific strike, and what sources of information about Nevatim's internal layout Iran had access to in order to plan it? And if the destruction of the F-35I fleet eliminates Israel's only credible conventional deep strike capability against Iranian strategic targets, compressing the escalation ladder to a binary choice between inaction and nuclear use, does the strike on Nevatim represent the most strategically dangerous single event of this conflict, not because of what it destroyed, but because of what it removed from the range of options available to decision makers who now face the next escalation with fewer tools to manage it? Let me know below. Subscribe and like if you want to keep following this. Click the video on screen to catch the last one. I will see you soon.